DeDakis. I'm a writing workshop leader, a writing coach, a manuscript editor, a novelist, and a former editor on CNN's The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer. You're one-to-one with me, and I'm one-to-one with best-selling author William Kent Krueger. I'm going to bring him in just a minute, but I want to give you a little context. I first came in contact with Kent Krueger's writing through my wife, Cindy. Cindy reads like a fiend. And there was one year, probably about 10 years ago, where I was on the board on a group of people that was the judging panel for the Edgar Awards for Mystery Writers of America. And I was getting like 10 books a day. And that's a lot of books. So, I'd throw them at Cindy and say, here, read this, read this, read this. And there were, it was a big team of people. So I wasn't the only one. And we all had books divided up, but we got all of the books that came. So early in the process, Cindy read Kent Krueger's Ordinary Grace, which I think, and we'll check this out with him, I think this was his first standalone book. He'd already had a series going. And Cindy read this and she said, this is the one. This is going to win. And so I said, okay, sure. And so I read it. Yeah, it was very good. And I recommended it to the rest of the group. Others read it. They liked it. Bottom line, it really did end up winning the best novel for, I think it was 2014, 2013, for Mystery Writers of America and their Edgar Award. So I've been a big fan of William Kent Krueger's writing for a long time, and yet so many books, so little time. So let's bring Kent in here and let me introduce you to him, because you're one-to-one with me and I'm one-to-one with Kent Krueger. Welcome.
Pleasure to be with you, John. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Am I right that Ordinary Grace was that your breakout novel, would you say?
Well, it broke me out to a much larger audience than simply mystery readers. I was a pretty big name in the mystery community before that, but there are a lot of people out there who aren't particularly fond of mysteries, and Ordinary Grace exposed me and my work to those folks in a really dramatic way.
And you had written the Cork O'Connor mysteries, and I think that they started in like 1998, something like that.
Yep.
So talk about the difference between a standalone and a series.
Sure, there are good reasons for writing both. If you write a series, there are lots of positives to a series. With each book, you don't have to recreate the wheel. You've created characters and a sense of place that readers are familiar with. There are certain elements that, as the author, you're going to have to include in the story because readers expect them to be there. Publishers love series because each new book in the series sells the backlist. And so there are really good reasons for writing a series, but there are pitfalls, and one of the major pitfalls is that readers might not be willing to follow you to a place that doesn't have this protagonist and these people in this setting that they have come to love so very much. And that was the situation with Ordinary Grace.
What's easier, a standalone or a series, or are they both hard and you feel like you just suck as a writer when you're in the middle of both?
Well, there are difficulties and blessings with both. I have to tell you that my two standout standalone novels, Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land, honest to God, were the two easiest manuscripts I've ever written. And that's because they came from a very different place than my Cork O'Connor series comes from. When I'm writing a Cork O'Connor story, it's a mystery. My stories in that series are essentially mysteries, and mysteries limit you. There are certain things you have to do in a mystery because it's what's expected. And a mystery also it's a construct of your mind. You create a puzzle. And then you work to make sure all the pieces of the puzzle fit and all of that. Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land didn't come from my head. They came from my heart.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like this outpouring that was just a phenomenal creative experience for me, John.
Mm-hmm. I want to. I'm going to bring Ordinary Grace back to the screen, and I'm going to lose this. This is a very low budget operation. I'm doing the switching, but I want to. I want to bring that full screen. And there was my dad was in the 104th Infantry Division during World War II, and back in about 2014, I think his unit had a reunion in Minneapolis, and of course, you're in the Twin Cities, and they asked me to give a keynote talk, and I quoted from Ordinary Grace at the very end. It's basically about a World War II vet who becomes a Methodist minister whose daughter is murdered, and I don't need to go into too much more detail about that. We can certainly talk about it a little later, but near the end of the book, there are just a couple of sentences that are very powerful. And this is what I read to these, these old vets. One of the characters says, "I understand now. The dead are never far from us. They're in our hearts and on our minds. And in the end, all that separates us from them is a single breath, one final puff of air." So, where did that come from? You say that came from your heart. Talk more about that. I'm getting a sense that there's a lot of spirituality going on there.
Yeah, I get a lot of comments on the ending. Those were the ending lines of Ordinary Grace. And I get an enormous number of notes from folks, readers, who really appreciate the novel, but particularly appreciate that final line. Because so many of us have lost people who are important in our lives, and we want to believe that we are really not that far from them. And one of the things I try to do in all of my work is give hope. So that's pretty much where that came from. It was, you know this, John. You're a novelist. You write fiction. One of the things that goes on when you write fiction is magic happens.
Oh, yeah.
Things come to us, and we have that are so much better than we think anything we could think of.
I call it the spookiness of the subconscious.
Oh, I love that. I love that, because I agree. I think if you are really a storyteller and you are letting yourself sink deeply into the imagining of a story, you go to a place that's below conscious thought. And oftentimes what you come up with are things that just amaze you, and you have to accept them as blessings and let go of wondering where the hell that came from.
Does that mean that when you write, you're writing seat of the pants? Does that mean you don't plan? How do you balance those two things?
Well, typically when I write a story in the Cork O'Connor series, because a mystery is a very tightly woven fabric of storytelling. Everything depends so significantly on everything else, and I think that the success of a mystery depends largely on the timing of the reveals. When do you give the reader the clues that are going to be necessary for solving the mystery at the heart of the story? So whenever I write a Cork O'Connor story, I think that story through as completely as I can before I ever put my fingers to the keyboard. At the end of that thinking process, which could go on months or weeks or even months, I know how the story begins. I know how it ends. I know who did what to whom and why. I know the moments of suspense I want to write to. I know where I'm going to plant my red herrings. And so I think those stories through pretty completely. Ordinary Grace in This Tender Land, I wanted a different creative process. I wanted the reader to feel that this was coming from my heart, and it was coming to them in the same way that it came to me, just spontaneously. And so I didn't plot out Ordinary Grace or This Tender Land. I simply knew essential plot points, and then I launched myself into the writing of it, and I let the spirit guide me. That sounds really woo-woo, doesn't it?
It does, but tell me more about that. I mean, when you say the spirit, I mean, are you religious? Are you a churchgoer? I mean, how would you describe your spirituality?
Yeah, I'm not a very religious guy. I attend church pretty regularly, but not because I buy into any of the doctrine. It's more that I enjoy being a part of a community who have joined me in the spiritual quest.
And were you raised in the church?
Yeah, I grew up Episcopalian, pretty
Same
devout
here. Same here.
Okay, okay. And then
Yeah.
after high school, I figured it was time to give up my spiritual journey. And I graduated in 1969, John. Yeah, I graduated into a world that was dominated by three things: sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
I
Our
graduated in 68.
Yeah,
So
there you go. That's a difficult competition for the spiritual journey.
it
So
is.
I thought I left my spiritual journey behind and embraced an entirely different kind of journey. But then I began to write the Cork O'Connor stories, and very often in those stories, the spiritual journey became an undercurrent in the plots that I created, and I had to embrace the fact that I had never really abandoned the spiritual journey, nor had it abandoned me.
Talk a little bit about the quote unquote radical activities that got you kicked out of Stanford University in during the Vietnam War.
Yeah, I matriculated at Stanford in the fall of 1969, and we were deep in the Vietnam War, such a
Yeah.
divisive issue in our nation. And for anybody who's old enough to remember, the spring of 1970 was when the shootings happened on the Kent State campus
Right.
in Ohio, and that's when we became aware that not only were we involved in war in Vietnam, we were also secretly bombing Cambodia and Laos as well. Um, Stanford at that point in time had a relationship with an organization called the Stanford Research Institute, SRI, whose primary source of income, at least in that point in time, as I understood it, was research into military weaponry. There were a lot of us at Stanford who felt that that was an inappropriate relationship for an institution like Stanford to maintain, particularly at that time in history. So we petitioned the Board of Trustees to sever the relationship. We petitioned the administration. We marched. We demonstrated, and of course, nobody listened to us because there was, I'm sure, huge sums of money involved. And finally, in frustration, one day a group of us organized, marched into the administration building, and occupied it. The president of the university, a pretty reasonable guy named Richard Lyman, said, "I'm not going to give any problem." He vacated the building and we took it over. That night, about 8 o'clock, we had a band come in and we held a dance where typically we would have registered for classes. About midnight, the band packed up and took off. And those of us who were going to occupy the building rolled out our sleeping bags and went to sleep. Huge tactical error, because at 1 a.m., the Palo Alto riot squad swept through and arrested us all. I was on a full scholarship to Stanford. It evaporated and I had to leave.
And you were okay with that or no? How did that affect you?
You know, that was a period of time where I believed everybody needs to stand up for what we believe is right, regardless of the consequences. Do I believe that now? Absolutely. I have never regretted my actions at Stanford, and I totally understand their response in kicking me out. It's what they had to do. But I got to tell you, John, I have always found it much more interesting to tell people I was kicked out of Stanford than that I graduated from the place.
Have you run into Vietnam vets since? And what kind of conversations would you say you've had with them?
Good conversations, because we all understand the confusion that we were all in at that point in time, reassessing what it meant to be a patriot, reassessing our values and our loyalties, trying to understand, when someone dies, what does it mean? And is it important really what they died for? And so I have met with a lot of vets, and there's been a lot of healing involved in that.
Explain. What do you mean healing?
Well, there were two pretty aggressive sides to the issue in Vietnam. There were I still remember this. I remember the smell of tear gas running through
I do too.
tear gas, and I remember the difficulty that those of my classmates who chose to go into the service fought in Vietnam, and some of whom were killed or were horribly wounded. Um, so I could see that, how they would hold what I decided to do. Um, they could be very angry as a result of that. And because of the debacle of Vietnam and all of the tragedy it caused itself, I could certainly blame them for allowing themselves to become a part of that. Blame serves no purpose. It's much easier to reach out and embrace and forgive. And that's what I've tried to do. And really, the vast majority of the veterans that I know and with whom I've spoken have tried to do as well.
How would you compare where we are today politically, in terms of political discourse, relationships, with back then 50 years ago during the Vietnam War?
I thought back then we could never be a nation more divided. I think I have reassessed that. I'm quite concerned about our nation and how the sides have taken stances, and both sides have taken stances that are so um, unsustainable in the end.
Well, it's almost as if we can't even agree on what the facts are. So
Yeah.
there's really no common ground politically, it would seem.
The one thing I try to hold to is this hope. Democracy is a messy business. It always has been, and it always will be. It will be threatened from all sides. There will be a pendulum that swings back and forth in terms of the conservative and the liberal approach to democracy. But democracy, I believe, will survive. We will get through this somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And my guess is down the road a piece, we'll be back here again.
I want to bring in the whole Cork O'Connor series because O'Connor is mixed race or mixed heritage, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Irish and Ojibwe. And let me pull the. I can't talk and push buttons at the same time, is what it really is.
Good thing you're not chewing gum, too.
Oh, man, that would be a mess. So, Fox Creek is your 19th book in the Cork O'Connor series. Tell us a little bit about Fox Creek, and then I have a follow-up.
Yeah, Fox Creek, as you say, is number 19 in this series, and it is a novel set in a contemporary time. The previous novel in the series, Lightning Strike, was a prequel, took place in the 1960s, and the book before that was Desolation Mountain. Now, Fox Creek, last year's book was Lightning Strike, a prequel. Mm-hmm. The book before that was This Tender Land, set in 1932, and then Desolation Mountain, 4 years ago, the last novel I set in a contemporary time. At the end of that contemporary novel, I left Cork O'Connor. No, actually, I left Henry Mallou, our beloved Henry Mallou, midday, the wise old medicine man, if you will, and Stephen in a really difficult situation because Henry Mallou and Stephen, who has visions, Cork's son, had a vision of Henry dead. And so I ended on that note in Desolation Mountain. Then I wrote This Tender Land and Lightning Strike. And finally, with Fox Creek, I had to come to terms with, well, what do I do about that situation? Mm-hmm. How do I solve that? So Fox Creek, I wrote in large measure to figure out whether Henry Mallou lived or died.
Because you didn't really know until you started writing.
I didn't really know. And I'm not going to say.
Yeah, okay. I won't put you on the spot there. Here's my question. Cork O'Connor is mixed heritage, Irish and Ojibwe. You don't have any Ojibwe, do you?
No.
So my question is, and you know where I'm going with this, the whole issue of cultural appropriation.
Yeah, it's a huge issue. I began writing my first Cork novel in 1992. And that was long before there were any discussions of cultural appropriation. Tony Hillerman was a huge icon in the mystery genre.
How do you define cultural appropriation?
I think it is selfish use of another culture, and
as opposed to just use.
As opposed to there are perfectly legitimate uses. Reasons that those of us who are not of one culture tap into another culture. And a lot of it is to try to open eyes to those who have all kinds of prejudices about another culture. I work very hard at getting the things that I talk about in terms of the Ojibwe culture right, in the hope that I can dispel a lot of those stereotypes that are still held by a lot of people in our nation about our Native brothers and sisters.
And arguably, you would have more of an audience with a white audience that needs to hear this, correct? They'd be more likely to listen to you?
Yeah, or read me, not necessarily listen to me.
Well, I meant
Uh,
listen
but,
metaphorically.
but I have a pretty broad audience, and so I know I'll have a lot of readers. And I very often, at the heart of my Corcocona stories, put an issue that's significant in the Native American community here.
And what kind of blowback or reaction are you getting from the white community? And I hate to generalize what the white community or, people of other races
Sure.
and tribes. What kind of reaction are you getting? Are you getting any blowback at all?
From the indigenous community, no. I've had nothing but complimentary responses to the work that I do. Here's an example. A while back, I got an email that went something like this: "Dear Mr. Krueger, I am the tribal librarian for the Lance Reservation, which is on the UP of Michigan." She said, "When any of our folks come in and they're not quite sure what they want to read, I will often recommend your books, because for a white guy, you do a pretty good job." And so that has typically been the response. I have lots of friends in the Ojibwe community, and they're often telling me, "Well, you didn't quite get that right, but that's okay. It wasn't significant.
Do
The
you
important
use
thing you got right."
do you use beta readers?
Of course I do. Every time I finish a manuscript in the Corco Connor series, I will give it to at least one, but usually two of my Ojibwe friends to read and vet for me. So I haven't said anything that's too stupid or even worse, offensive.
The same people, or have these people changed over the years?
Many of them are the same, but depending upon the expertise I need, I have tapped various folks in the community.
Okay. Your most recent book is really a novella. And again, let me bring that up. It's an audio book, and my wife and I just finished listening to it together. And it's called The Levee. It's set in 1927 along the Mississippi River during the biggest flood of in modern U.S. history, I guess you could say. And my question is, well, first tell us a little bit more about it, and why an audiobook? Why not a novella? I mean, in a hard copy.
Yeah, well, the reason is nobody will buy a novella, just a novella. If you look at Stephen King will put together a compilation of novellas, 3 or 4 novellas, and it's sold that way. A single Stephen King hard copy of a novella uh, would be a hard sell. But a novella in an audiobook is really a kind of a perfect format and a perfect length,
Mhm,
because the levy runs about 3.5 hours.
mhm.
Doesn't take all that long to listen to. And so my publisher, when they saw this piece come to them, they were the ones who suggested we'd like to experiment and give it a shot. And hey,
And
I'm
and
not adventurous.
and you do an author's note at the end and explain that this is a story that really has stuck with you since before you were ever published, I think. Tell that story about its origin.
Yeah, I was working at the University of Denver in the food service department. I was the cashier in the student union, and I had some downtime, and I happened to be reading. I was reading uh, a collection of William Faulkner's short works, which included a piece called "The Old Man," which is about a convict during the great flooding of the Mississippi River who is assigned to go help a pregnant woman. I loved that story. Very, it's Faulknerian, very difficult prose, but I just love the whole idea of that story.
Sort of the king of the run-on sentence, right?
Yeah, yeah. And whenever I read Faulkner, I have to keep a dictionary next to me because he uses so many words. I think I'm a pretty bright guy, but he uses words I have no idea what the hell they mean. So I thought I'd give it a shot. So I tried my hand at the levee and writing a short story, and wasn't all that pleased with it. Put it aside. Then in my 40s, I took a creative writing class at the University of Minnesota, and pulled out the levy and tried it again, made it a little longer, and the class really liked it, but felt that there was more story involved here. So I put it aside, and then the pandemic rolled around, and I had finished all of my contractual obligations and was looking for something more. So I dipped back into that stack of unpublished works that I had, pulled out the levy, and really rethought it completely into this longer piece. And finally, I thought, I got it right this time.
You did. You did. And I mean, I can't speak for the earlier versions, but this one is usual. Your writing is memorable because the settings are memorable, the characters are intriguing and complicated, and there's one scene that again, I don't want to give away too much, but it's a scene where three not so very nice people die, and the temptation, because they're so terrible, is to just throw them in the river or just let them rot, and life goes on. But one of your characters is an ex-priest, and he decides that a prayer would be appropriate, and maybe I'm not doing a good enough job setting it up, so correct me if I'm wrong, and then please, if you don't mind, read that expert of the prayer that he delivers.
Sure. And you pretty much nailed it there, John.
Okay.
That was a pretty good setup.
That never happens.
All right. So as they're standing on the levee, prepared to commit the bodies of these three not very good men to the river, the ex-priest decides to say a few words. The priest looks up at the night sky, the stars and the moon, as if seeking inspiration there. We come into this world formless clay, and our hearts are shaped by our experience. He begins. What brutal hands shaped the hearts of these three men, I can't say. But I can say this: they have already been forgiven. God, who created the clay from which they came, from which we all come, promised forgiveness even before he put them into this world. God knows our struggles, and for each of us, he hopes the best. He pauses, and Dobbs wonders if that's the end. Then Mobley continues. We're no different from these lifeless men. We too struggle against anger, against hate, against desire, against pride. Rather than the rancor that may be in our hearts at this moment, we should feel a sense of gladness, because the struggle of these men has ended. They will rest now. Their hardened hearts will be softened. They will hate no more, desire no more, feel no more pain. But those of us standing here, we have the struggle still ahead. May God be swift in gathering the spirits of these men into his holy presence, and may he be merciful and forgiving toward those of us who remain. Mobley appends no amen, and Dobbs believes he understands why. It was not really a prayer, and was not really meant for the dead.
Whew. You mentioned earlier that your religiosity is not really
Religiosity. Stay away from religious religiosity.
Well, let me finish the question now. Let me finish the question. Let's put it this way. Your spirituality is, in a sense, devoid of maybe you didn't use the word devoid, but it's not doctrinaire.
Yeah.
And that seems to me to be what really is the problem right now in the US with the evangelicals who are very doctrinaire, but they've gone for someone who is amoral, which I find just stunning. And so again, what you've written, set in 1927, seems to still speak to the spiritual divide, I think you could say.
Yeah, I have to look at that religious rite and think that they have forgotten everything, all the beatitudes that Jesus delivered in the Sermon on the Mount, all of those beautiful things, guideposts for the way we should behave toward one another. They have just completely put them aside.
Are you hopeful, though? I mean, are we going to get beyond this?
Yeah, I am hopeful. It's John. It's only when we abandon hope that we're lost.
Okay. Well, what gives you hope?
All the beautiful things I see around me every day, not just the natural creation, but all the beautiful things I see people doing for one another. My daughter works with a homeless population here, and almost every day she's out in these encampments delivering food and helping people find shelter and guiding them to the services they need. And I look at my daughter. I look at my daughter and I think there's hope. There is hope.
Mhm. What you've been writing for a long time. What do you know now that you wish you'd known then when you first started getting serious about getting published?
uh, that there's going to be a whole lot more business involved in what you do than you can possibly imagine.
Has that been discouraging?
It's what every author deals with, the business part of what we do. It's absolutely necessary. But for me, it is the least, it gives me back the least in terms of energy. When I sit down to write, I come away from it exhausted and energized. And I know you understand what I mean by that. But when I'm doing the business of it, I just come away exhausted.
I know. Are you an introvert or an extrovert? And how does your personality type work with the whole marketing side of being an author?
I don't think you can categorize me, John. Um, I
You're an
love
ambivert, an ambivert.
an ambivert. I love I'm a writer, and I love my time. I have to kind of cloak myself in me in order to accomplish that. But God, do I love going out and doing book events and speaking and meeting my readers. That energizes me in a significant way too.
Yeah, yeah. So, what kind of advice do you have for wannabe writers? People who really think that they've got a story inside that's been nagging them for decades, let's say. Um, what's your advice?
So my first piece of advice to any aspiring writer is this: marry somebody with a good job. Um, and uh, and the other, on a more serious note, would be this: write because you love what you do. Don't write because you hope you're going to get rich and famous at it, or you think you're going to be, it'd be really cool to call yourself a writer. Write because it's what your heart tells you you have to do. And if you do that, then and write every day, because if you do that, if you're really true to that, eventually I think you'll discover the writer you were always meant to be, and you'll be writing the stories you were always meant to write, and that's when all of the doors will open for you.
What is your process?
I write every day, 7 days a week, up at first light, or in winter before first light.
Before noon.
Yeah, usually I'm up a little before 6 o'clock.
Mhm.
In the pre-pandemic days, I would get myself dressed and go to a coffee shop where I would spend the first 2 or 3 hours writing.
Isn't that distracting?
You know, my process began in a coffee shop. I began getting serious about writing when my wife entered law school, and I became the sole support of the family. I was the guy who had to keep a roof over her head and food on the table, but I wanted desperately to be a writer. And I was living about 2 blocks from an iconic cafe here in St. Paul, a place called the St. Clair Broiler, that opened its doors at 6 o'clock every morning. So I pitched this idea to my wife. I said, Diane, if you're willing to get the kids up and dressed and fed and off to school first thing so I can go write, I swear to you, when I come home from my job at the end of the day, I'll be the best husband, the best father you can possibly imagine. She bought it. So there I was every morning at the St. Clair Broiler, writing for a little over an hour every day before I went to work. So my process developed in a coffee shop.
Yeah, and so that's your comfort zone.
Yeah, it's my office.
But how do you guard against distractions, interruptions, or does that matter?
The noise is all white noise. When I'm really into a story, and I have sunk myself deeply into the imagining, I'm somewhere else. It's not uncommon. In the old days, it wasn't uncommon for me to get my coffee, sit down, start writing, and an hour will go by. My coffee's cold. I've been somewhere. I've been somewhere else. And it's not, when people know where I write, it's not uncommon for them to, in the past, for them to to come up to me and they're very respectful in their approach. They just want to say, I like your work, or sometimes they'll bring a book that they would like me to sign. I have had no problems with that.
When you write, are there issues that you're working through? I mean, the river is a constant theme in a lot of your standalones, especially um, uh, war, or at least the aftermath of war, how war has scarred people. That seems to be a recurring theme in some of the stories. So, are you working stuff out?
Probably. So I grew up post World War II. Um, and my father and so many of the fathers of my friends came back from either World War II or the Vietnam War, um, wounded men. They went away kids. They were like 18, 19 years old, and they came back these very wounded men. That was certainly my father.
Mhm. In
And
what way? In what way wounded would you say your dad was?
well, he was wounded in body. He came back with shrapnel still in him.
Mhm.
He was on. He received money from the VA his entire life, but more wounded in spirit. He went away thinking he wanted to come back, go to college and become a lawyer. Uh, that experience of the work changed him so dramatically that when he came back, he wanted to give what he thought was something significant to the world, and so he became a high school English teacher.
Mhm.
And so it I do explore the wounding that those that kind of experience causes. Um, but I also explore other kinds of wounding. What's significant to me in all of this is how do we manage to heal? And we heal one another. We don't heal ourselves, we heal one another. And how does that happen? So that's what interests me.
Um, Talk more about how we help each other heal. What are some of the takeaways that you've discovered in your writing process about the healing process?
Yeah, forgiveness is at the bottom of everything, John.
What do you mean?
You've got to let go of anger. You have to let go of hate. You have to let go of everything that puts a vice on your heart, and open up. I mean, look at South Africa. Once apartheid was finished, did they rise up and kill their white oppressors? No, they created these moments when both sides could forgive and heal. Um, so for me, forgiveness is at the bottom of it all. And ordinary grace, for me, the whole idea of ordinary grace is that the grace that we all experience is that here on earth is grace that we channel. It's the divine grace that we channel and offer one another, through our willingness to forgive, for our willingness to embrace the brokenness, the woundedness, um, that is what it is to be a human being.
How do I mean, I don't know exactly how to phrase the question, but um, there is so much grief and loss. I mean, my sister took her life in 1980. My youngest son died of a heroin overdose 11 years ago. So grief and loss are things that I also write about, and so and those are themes that run through your stories as well. And so, based on your experience as a person and as a writer, what are some things that people can do to help other people in addition to the forgiveness thing, just in terms of the interactions? Because people try to say things that are comforting, but often they kind of blunder in their they mean well, but it doesn't always work. So do you have any, I don't know, advice, guidance, insights?
I would just offer one piece of advice: instead of talking, listen.
How does that work? I mean, that means you got to get somebody talking.
Um, yeah, I'm not saying that it's necessarily easy, particularly for people who have locked so much away in their hearts for so very long. And I'm not a therapist. I'm not a man of the cloth. I don't have any particularly significant insights. One thing I do know, John, is I have always been a listener, and I know that for whatever reason, people open up to me in really dramatic, intimate ways.
And they wouldn't if you didn't ask questions, right?
Well, that's it. You have to be interested in other people. Really have to be interested in other people. Get outside yourself.
Oh, that's a great line. That's a great line. That is so true. And what I've discovered, and it sounds like you have too, is that as soon as you start asking questions, because we live in a society that's polite. No one wants to really make you uncomfortable. But if you go beneath the surface, I've discovered, and apparently you have too, people blossom. You've given them permission to talk about stuff that's been festering often, and
And
then they have a chance to get it out.
I'm not Catholic, but I certainly believe in the ritual of confession,
Mhm.
uh, because we all have things that trouble us. We all have those dark secrets that we hold tight, and we think that if anybody knows them, it will be the ruin of us. Um, and to let that go, to let that go, what an enormous grace that is when that occurs.
How did you come to these realizations?
By living 72 years.
It helps to be old, right?
Yeah, it does. It does. Getting old is a bitch. On the other hand, you get a lot from it.
What are you working on now? What's next?
Well, I have a new novel coming out, a standalone novel coming out in the fall. It's called The River We Remember. And once again,
There's that river again.
yeah, rivers are important. They're such wonderful metaphors for so many things. And
Yes.
once again, I touch on the issue of healing. This is a story about takes place in post World War II, and I was able, in Ordinary Grace, I only touched the surface. In The River We Remember, I wanted to go more deeply into the issue of all of that great wounding, and how did we help one another heal. So
What?
it's a mystery. It's a bona fide mystery. It's about the leading citizen of a small town in southern Minnesota who is murdered, and who and why did that happen. But it's about a lot of other things too.
What? This is and probably an unfair question, but what percent of you and your experience is in your novels?
Well, I'm a storyteller. And I think one of the reasons those of us who are storytellers is that we possess the ability, for whatever reason, to sink ourselves deeply into the imagining of an experience we have not had ourselves, and somehow find the words to make it feel real to the reader. So a lot of what I write about, you talk about grief. I have never lost anybody so close to me in such a sudden and traumatic way, but I can imagine what that must be like. Um, that said, isn't there a lot of every writer in their books? How can it not? How can there not be?
Exactly. Exactly. I wish we could go on. I mean, this is your website, williamkentkrueger.com. So people can contact you through your website. Anything I haven't covered that you'd like to get to?
This has just been a wonderful
Oh,
conversation,
thank you.
John.
Well, I
The
feel the
time
same
has
way.
just
Thank you.
flown by.
It has. Um, Look, you're gonna be at writers' conferences this year. Do you have a full schedule of travel?
I have a full schedule of travel. I won't be at a lot of conferences. I'm doing a lot of individual events. I'm skipping BoucherCon, the International Mystery Convention this year, because I'm going to be in Alaska for a little R&R. I'm skipping Left Coast Crime, if you know Left Coast Crime.
I'm gonna be there, so I'll miss you
It,
there. I'll
it's
miss
a
you in two
great
places now.
conference. I hate missing it, but for a variety of reasons, I have to miss it. The
So
two
which conferences are you gonna go to?
I don't think I'm doing any conferences at all this year,
Oh
which is an
no.
odd year for me. But the following, schedules were just crazy this year. I have just an enormously busy event schedule.
Well,
But the following year,
next year, BoucherCon and Killer Nashville are like a week apart, right?
yeah, yeah. Have you been to Killer Nashville?
Several times.
Yeah, I love Killer Nashville.
Yep, yep. I'm going to try to get Clay Stafford to get into the crosshairs on this show as
Oh,
well.
that would be a fun conversation.
Oh, I've already interviewed him once at the last Killer Nashville, so
Okay.
he's. I have to really be persistent. He's shy, I think.
he presents a particular kind of front, and he doesn't want you to get below that.
Yeah, well, he hasn't. We'll get there. We'll get there. Um, this has been so much fun. I'm John DeDakis. We've been talking with William Kent Krueger, and let's do this again sometime. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you.
I'd love to. Invite me back.
I will. Take care.
You too.